Hello, the two of you. Even though I would generally try to start minutes on top of the hour, I think it would make sense to wait a few minutes because there's three of us, and while that is a group, I think we will have a more productive interaction if there are a few more. Interesting. What?
Yeah, Marco responded to me on the Jabber before Meet Echo started. So my response on Zulip actually is now part of the meeting because it is in the time span of 10 minutes before the meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just wondered why there is no meeting materials link on the data tracker upcoming page, and Marco sleuthed out that this is because we didn't submit a separate agenda.
Let me have a look. Yeah, we used to have a dummy agenda, but given that the actual agenda is always in the minutes anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we should always submit a single line agenda that has a pointer to the notes page.
Yeah, I used to do this. I think I should. Yeah, I should add this retroactively for the ones in this term, which Barry had set up. Yep, we'll do that.
Yeah, at least that seems to be the reason.
Okay.
I don't know if it's intentional. Maybe it's something to discuss in the tools team.
Yeah,
I mean, the material page exists anyway, so why not link into it? Even though there's no agenda, you may still have something else.
Yeah, so it's probably to punish meetings that didn't upload the agenda.
Hello, Ricard. I know that we will be a rather short group, given that Ira said that he won't be here today and Barry won't be here either.
Yeah, I don't know whether Michael is coming.
Let's give him
he at least provided feedback on the mailing list, so I'm not at all unhappy.
Let's use those 2 minutes to go through the formalities. So this is a CBOR meeting. We are an IETF meeting. Please be nice to each other and follow the note well. And where are the minutes? Yeah, the link to the minutes is I'll post it here again just in case anyone missed it. And thanks, Marco, for adding to the minutes. We have basically two items on the agenda today, CDDL 2.0 and CBOR path, both of which we have in your slides, Carsten. So maybe maybe you could already just start them up, and if Michael still joins. Sorry, Grant. We don't have to hit off into the most important parts right away.
Yeah, so let me just do the CBOR path thing on one slide. So this popped up more or less independently, and I think it's a pretty obvious thing. I mean, I can probably reveal the secret that I actually became an editor of the JSON path document with a view to actually being able to use the work in the CBOR context. So this was quite foreseeable, and now somebody has stepped up and actually started defining what they think and CBOR path is. And I think it's pretty interesting. So my initial view was that a CBOR adaptation of JSON path would essentially work with JSON path as is, but then we don't get access to the more extensive generic data model of CBOR, so we don't get access to bytes or to map keys that are not text strings. So that's one thing. And the other thing, of course, is that CBOR has a third container kind, which is tags. So JSON has arrays and maps, which are called objects in JSON. And CBOR has arrays. Maps are a little bit extended because the keys can be anything, not just strings. And then we have tags. So those are the obvious places where a CBOR path would extend JSON path. So I always thought, let's finish JSON path, and we are almost there. So yesterday we had an interim where we essentially got stuck on a type system issue that we probably need a couple more days to understand. But we should then go into working group last call. So interestingly, the other Michael has, with a long last name that I cannot remember, has generated a Rust implementation. Instead of writing the document first, he wrote the code first, and I think that's not at all a bad way to start with that. And one interesting thing he contributed was, let's not use text for this, but structured CBOR. So we are not going to make the detour over a URI to a CRI, but we will be starting with a CRI in the first place. Well, this is not a URI, but you understand what I mean. So
not quite. So the format of the CBOR path would be CBOR already. Is that?
Yes.
Which of course could be shown in diagnostic notation.
Exactly. So the diagnostic notation that would result from Michael's proposal here is not that bad. So I think we could live with that. But I mostly wanted to raise this so people who know that we will have to do that, and obviously the next step somewhere in the CDDL world is doing what DSDL did by adding schematron to RelaxNG. We will probably need some way of attaching predicates to places in our data models. And something like CBOR path or an extended form of CBOR path may be the obvious way to do this. So yeah, that's going to come up. Maybe not this week, maybe not this year, but definitely CBOR path is something that we want to have in our toolset. So please have a look at this GitHub issue, which is on the CBOR GitHub IO page. We always have a hard time putting up issues for a working group, but I think that's pretty much as good as it gets. Mm-hmm. And look at the issue, look at the linked Rust implementation. I didn't put the link on the slide because you can get to it from there. And it would be great to have some discussion that might include the CBOR media list. So that's all I have about this one.
Thanks. I personally haven't had a chance to look into it, but sounds like something that would be good to have.
Yeah, so it's probably most useful for those people who are in the Venn diagram between the JSON path people and the CBOR people, and probably that part of the Venn diagram is pretty small at the moment, and I'm trying to get more people interested.
I was more thinking, I was not so much thinking about JSON path, but more in the direction of, like, people don't use the traditional tools, sed, cut, org, etc. so much anymore, but start using JQ. And yeah. I think this would kind of having something that works with CBOR, and I think CBOR path would fit the bill here, might make things good, better here.
Yeah, so maybe at some point we can have a discussion about tools that might like CBOR support added to them. So JQ certainly is a nice tool. I found that it's very different in usage from what I would use a CQ for. So I wasn't so motivated to actually get a student to submit a patch to JQ. But let's see. So go ahead.
I was just thinking more on a high level, not
Yeah,
necessarily like exactly JQ, but
right.
it might find a place in tooling.
Yeah.
Any questions on that topic, Marco, Ricard?
Not for
Not
me.
specific from me either.
Thanks. Being 10 past, I'm afraid we won't have Michael here today, so I'd say let's go onto the CDDL2 anyway, and hope to produce something useful also in the minutes for those who review this later.
Yeah, and we also have the recording. So yeah, let's talk about the current spike. So I just wanted to implement something so we can play with it. So this is not necessarily exactly what we will put into CDDL 2.0. On the other hand, I find what we came up with so far actually quite useful. And it's almost an 80% solution to the things I actually need. So let's see. But essentially, it's trying to address three requirements. One is a requirement for someone who has a slightly larger CDDL project to construct the CDDL from multiple files. So files are taking the role of a module. Here, I think we all have tried languages that do multiple modules per file, and that can be hard to use. So maybe equating files and modules for the moment, I get to this in a little bit more detail later, works. So when I'm doing a project where I need CDDL for, I may want to have multiple files, and I may want to integrate them in a well-defined way. Of course, I can do this with a makefile and cat. But yeah, it's more interesting to actually have a file that has a standardized meaning that every tool can understand, or that at least every tool can somehow process. So that's one thing. Maybe more important is to be able to reference existing CDDL as a library. So what the previous one is handled by the include directive. This is handled by the import directive, which otherwise are very similar. But the difference here is that when you use an existing CDL file as a library, you do not necessarily need everything that's in there. So when I write CDL specifically for a project, then of course what I write there is meant for the project. So it is all meant to go into that project. But if I use an existing CDDL as a library, then maybe I only need CoC encrypting and not CoC signer, vice versa. So that's what import is doing. And finally, there is a very small appendix here that actually does something that reminds of namespaces. So that's the as clause in an include or an import. So that's really what this little spike is trying to do. We still have a CDDL2 plan document, which has a few other things that also have to go into CDDL2. These, of course, are not going away. But this is, I think, the most useful start for doing some module structure and some namespacing. So the approach here is pretty weird. So the idea is that those things can all be done by a CDDL processor. So I'm not calling it CDDL preprocessor because the CDDL processor is fully aware of the semantics of what it's actually throwing around here. So it's not like the C preprocessor that doesn't understand C. The CDDL processor actually fully understands what a rule is and how you, for instance, would substitute names in that and so on. So the CDDL processor would make use of the fact that we plan CDDL2 to be a superset of CDDL1 and would essentially process everything that doesn't work everywhere, but in almost all cases would process everything that is not CDDL1 and turn it into compatible CDDL1. So we can continue to use CDDL Cogen and Andrew Weiss CDDL tool and the early CDDL tool, which I hope will go away within this year. Just make sure that the CDDL2 introduction is not disruptive. Nobody feels like they cannot use CDDL tool because their tools are not yet supporting them. The other effect of having the CDDL processor spit out CDDL1 is that whatever processing is going on is very inspectable. So you never have a question mark in your mind of what's actually going to go on. You just look in the output of the CDDL processor and will be able to find out what your directives actually did. So this is an implementation approach. It's of course not the only implementation approach, not the only valid one. So some implementations will simply integrate that, and actually that's going to happen in the inverse direction with CDDL-C, which is a CDDL processor, and we'll get all the other parts of the early CDDL tool in time. But on the other hand, if you have an implementation that really is trying to be simple and focused on a specific issue like code generation, maybe you don't want to implement all of CDDL1 even, and a CDDL processor might be able to help you. So CDDL-C has a prototype genericizer. So if your CDDL tool doesn't support generics, that's not a problem because you can convert your CDDL input to generics-free CDDL and process that with your tool. So that may not be satisfying for another reason, because maybe the way the CDDL1 is generated is not what your tool needs, but that's of course a separate issue. So the prototype right now is in the CDDL-C tool, which is essentially a converter or compiler for CDDL, and you use it by using the -2 flag, which means it's supposed to do CDDL2 stuff. And that currently only works with output type CDDL. So -T CDDL is an option you need to put there. And of course, if you know POSIX command line argument rules, you can stick this together. So -2T CDDL is what you will typically use. And yeah, you apply this to one or more input CDDL files and get a combined CDDL1 file, which I have called completed CDDL here. And often you don't even do that, but you just pipe the output into another tool. So you can generate instances, that's the CDDL-GP here, or you can verify instances, that would be the -VP. Or excuse me, validate is the right word, not verify. So the need for this will go away with respect to the early CDDL tool, but of course other tools that do code generation or things like that will still need that. So that's how you use this. And yeah, let me just explain the main components of this, and I will start to ask questions to myself a few slides from now, but right now I'm just presenting what this prototype does. Semicolon hash include does a wholesale inclusion of another CDL file. And the wholesale inclusion is sometimes a good idea because when you're developing something, you want to be aware of unused rules. So that's why there is an include and not just an import. The import simply gets rid of unused rules, and that's exactly what you don't want in a development situation. So if you wrote a rule and then that isn't used, then probably something is not working right. The import directive operates on an undefined list. So when the CDL processor processes a CDL file, it looks at all the rules in there and computes a set of rule names that are not defined. So not defined here means the current module doesn't define them, and it's also not defined in the prelude. The prelude is currently still a special case. I hope to be able to explain what the prelude does, the thing where rule names like int and float and so on are defined. So of course that shouldn't turn up in an undefined list. So it is somewhat special, and that will probably change at some point. So after processing the file and removing all used names that were defined and all names that are defined in the prelude, you have a list of names that somebody still has to define, and that's the undefined list. And what import does is it looks at the module to be imported and tries to find those names. And if those names are in a rule in the imported module, then that rule is imported, plus everything that is not defined in that rule, every additional name that it uses that is not defined gets added to the undefined list. And we do that until we have either finished the undefined list or there is no resolution for an undefined. Christian.
A brief question. If the thing that is being imported has internally missing items, will those missing items just leak and create some scope that I would consider weird, in that it only later gets imported by another import?
Yeah, that's the subject of isolation. And
or do all undefined items from an import need to be resolved?
So the undefined list of the imported item doesn't leak into the undefined list that will be used by the next import. So there is some isolation here, but definitely the way this isolation acts is something we need to discuss in a few real-world examples. But I would expect I'm going to use import on something that already is somewhat stable and somewhat complete. So it knows how to do this, and what the one of the next slides says is that the imported module can, of course, itself have imports again. And those are, at least conceptually, processed before the imported module is even looked at. So for instance, RFC 9053, the COSI algorithms, defines a few pieces of CDDL that only make sense if you are using RFC 9052, the COSI structure standard. And so if you ever include 9053, you actually want those rules from 1952. But you don't necessarily want all the other rules of 1952. So the 1953 module only includes those rules from 1952 that are needed to complete the rules that are in 1953. Yeah, I understand the silence, but it really works out quite well in practice. Okay, so this is all fine. There is a little additional thing, and that's where the namespaces come in, because the world that you are importing here may be huge, and there may be lots of things defined in there. It's probably a good idea to be able to namespace them. And the as clause in the include, that can actually be used to say, I don't want these rules to be imported as they are, but I want them to get a namespace prefix, which is just something with a dot, ending with a dot. And that makes sure that the rule names do not conflict. But you don't have to do that if what you are importing is trivial enough, or you know that they already have taken care of namespacing, of using unusual names in some way in their module. And I'm going to get to this in a moment. Okay, and this is the slide that actually tries to answer the isolation thing. So when a file is referenced by an import or an include, that referenced file is import include processed before it's actually going into the import include process that initiated all this. So the processing of the referenced file happens in isolation. The referencing context does not change the meaning of a referenced module, and I think that that's a pretty important property that we want to maintain. So you don't get surprises in what import actually means based on what environment the import set up. The only thing that is bridging between the two is the undefined list. So this means that indirectly imported rules are present in the imported module. So when you import 1953, then everything from 1952 that is needed to do 1953 is in the 1953 module as well. And that's not a problem because we have this idempotent redefinition idea in CDDL, so it doesn't hurt if things are defined a few times. But also, if you actually use namespacing, then you will further increase the isolation here. So the rules actually even have different names. But it means that if you include 1953, then you actually get to use the party info definition that is in 1952. So you don't have to do anything to do that. But because you have to have it to operate on what 1953 defines. But you are not getting all the rest of COSI in there unless you do a separate import of 1952. And I think that actually addresses Jeremy's concern or Jeremy's observation about the weirdness of doing nested includes that actually might not span a tree, but have a general directed acyclic graph, and that leads to multiple includes, and multiple includes are not idempotent in C, and they are idempotent here.
So like diamond includes.
Yeah, and they are innocuous. They also, by namespacing, can be made even more innocuous, so they don't even touch. So you can entflechten your tree. What's the English word for entflechten? Okay, so, pardon me?
Disentangle, I think.
Disentangle, thank you. So where do we get those module targets from? So basically, I thought this is really something that should not be nailed down in the module files, because you want to freely move around module files, and the modules are not going to know where they are and where the modules are that these modules are actually including. And if you actually want to do a new version of a module, for some reason you want to do a bug fix, then you have to make sure that you don't get the original one, but the new one, and so on. So I thought that the place where the module targets come from should be defined in an environment variable, and that's called CDDL include path. That works like most Unix path environment variables. So it's a number of directories that are separated with a colon. And dot, of course, is the current directory. And there is a special meaning for the empty string. So the empty string points to the batteries included space defined by the CDLC module. Now that's probably something that we have to get some agreement on what's in there. But as long as we only have one implementation of the CDDL processor, I think we can ignore this problem. And once we get a second, then we probably want to set up some coordination in yangcatalog.org or something like this, an IANA registry. If IANA is willing to play along with this, that makes sure that these batteries included are compatible between different implementations. So right now, that directory includes CDDL from all RFCs that were done in the XML age, so from 8650 onwards. I haven't actually looked if earlier RFCs have interesting CDDL, so I would love to get feedback on that. And of course, doing something like the 7071 example that is in 8610 would also be a nice thing to include there, even if it's not totally official, but at least it has been published in an RFC. So most of the things come from your file system, and a few things come from this batteries included directory. And deliberately, I didn't try to address sources from the web because that's complicated. And that's why you see an empty checkbox beside the to-do called scraping here. Because essentially, I think we will need to do scraping on essentially everything that we referenced, including internet drafts. So the three things that I think we need to have is IANA, internet drafts, and some form of GitHub import. So you actually can point to someone else's project, which of course doesn't need to be limited to GitHub. Certainly it should include other places like GitLab. But yeah, manufacturers might have sites with that as well, and so on. So we are in yangcatalog.org space here, and probably need to do the same kind of thinking here. Yeah, so the CDDL include path really is the most important part here, and the rest will come over time. So this is the import side. And now we maybe should quickly talk about the export side. So how do you actually export CDDL from an internet draft or RFC? And the default export is to simply take all source code elements that have the type CDDL, extract the text from them, and concatenate them. this usually gives you something that is useful. It may give you a little bit more if the RFC hasn't taken care of separating its examples from its normative content. So that there is something called add name, the name attribute in the source code element of RFC XML that you can use to sort source code fragments into different buckets, and we just need at least a convention for how to use the add name for doing this sorting, or you will have to actually manually scrape. And so for the like 20 RFCs that I have in the batteries included directory, about half of them had some manual tampering to make sure what we get is actually useful. So often you will actually not just throw out stuff, but you actually want to have separate modules. And then, of course, these separate modules need names. And yeah, we should have a convention. The name, of course, should derive from the add name attribute, so you get some control over that. Yeah, and I also added some semicolon hash imports to some of the CDL files. I talked about what you need for 1953, so that is not useful unless you also include 1952. And so this is kind of automated here, and we certainly should automate that in any future CDDL we export, so we don't have to do this manually. Okay, so the checkbox is empty because we need a convention for how to export something from a document. And one question, of course, is do we actually need a directive to control that? I said we can use the name attribute to sort something into a different bucket, but maybe we want to annotate this with some additional information so it's clear how this is imported. So the export statement that's in the second line of the slide is, yeah, that can be a convention. We don't have to write this into the document, but there may be other things that are a little bit harder to infer from what's in the document. So maybe we need something like an export directive here. I don't know of any need yet, but we might come up with something. So a different thing that an export directive could do, or maybe that's really two different directives, would be to identify those names in a library module that actually are meant to be imported. So for instance, well, I didn't write all of them, but in the COSI module in 1952, of course, COSI key and COSI encrypt and COSI encrypt 0 are really the ones that are meant to be imported and not label or values. Those are not definitions that make any sense on its own. They make sense in the context of a COSI module, but they probably need to be namespaced away so your label and your values are not impacted by a possibly inconsistent definition. So again, I'm not sure we need this. I didn't need this in the current experiments, but it's something we could do if we find out that this is useful. Okay, so this is scraping documents. Scraping IENA is harder to do because IENA has no defined API. So whatever scraping we do is probably going to be tentative, and we are going to rework this at some time when IENA gets an API. In London, I talked to some IENA people, and they seem to have a defined API on their radar now. So they thought we should be having some discussions in this year and help them define the requirements for that. On the other hand, an experiment is only a good experiment if we can do something now. So I was trying to come up with something that actually makes sense with the undefined API that IANA currently has. And for instance, for COSI, which is always my go-to example, there is something called IANA assignments cosi.xml. And in that, you can look for registry elements that have record elements that have value elements. And you have to look at the ID attribute of the registry to find out how that registry is actually called. And this could be extracted using something like a .IANA operator. I'm not phrasing this as a directive because that directive would have to interact in a weird way with names, but that's also something that we definitely can change here. So the three variables here are COSI, algorithms, and value. So the values you find in the COSI algorithms registry would go into a type choice here that is essentially the content of the .IANA registry. So COSI algorithm would mean all values that are registered in the COSI algorithms registry. And of course, the meaning of that changes over time. So that's another reason not to do this at the directive level. Christian.
Is this only about limiting values, or would this also give us some means of annotating, say, a numeric value with its label or with another field? Because these annotations are something that's, I think, also on the radar for CDDL2, and getting them from there might be convenient.
That's a very good comment. Yes. Yeah. So this is here essentially focusing on the selection, but there may need to be some transformation, some projection, and so on. And we have to collect use cases like the one you just sketched to make sure we have good mechanisms here. Okay, scraping internet drafts is, I think I mostly covered that, and definitely we will only support this for XML submitted IDs. So those people who want to write their CDDL drafts in NREF, they will have to do their own scraping.
That's the thing?
Yes, I actually worked with someone who was it getting an old RFC back to NREF. So this still exists, yes.
Wow.
So it's a lot of work for the Secretariat because the Secretariat then has to do the transformation from NREF to XML since RFC 8650. But yes, it does exist. And there are also people writing their internet drafts in Word, so in WinWord. Yeah, so when we reference a draft, then we have the usual issue whether we actually want to reference a specific revision to get a stable outcome, or reference the newest revision to get, the newest outcome. So that will need to be specified probably by simply attaching the -10 revision number to the import name, and then you know it's a specific revision, except for the one internet draft that actually describes how to delete code points 8, 9, and 10 from BGP, which is called draft something delete 8-9-10. And that is, fortunately it doesn't have CDL in it, so we don't have to discuss this. There are, of course, also internet drafts that have multiple modules in them, so the same considerations about using the name attribute for source code elements, and defining a good convention for that applies here. Next question, scraping other sources. Luckily, the other organizations that actually use CDDL all are stuck in some weird IPR issues. So we haven't needed to do this, but I'm hearing that this is changing now. So we might have some interesting other SDOs that expose their CDDL, and we may want to scrape that. So if you encounter some need to do that, please tell the list or tell me. Now, next, namespacing. So the import statement here, import RFC 9052 as COSI, just is an instruction to the CDDL processor to actually prefix all names that are in the imported rules that are not prelude names with COSI dot. So the only exception is prelude names. Christian.
Looking at what was done in 9252, the idea back then might have been to do something like from RFC 9052 import cozy underscore wildcard. Question is, does it still make sense to follow that route, or do we just accept that this is a route not taken?
Well, using wildcarding to select from a collection of names is somewhat brittle. It might work out here, but I would be a little bit hesitant to make this a major feature, because this works until it doesn't. And you might not have much control over when it stops working. I mean, for stable RFCs, it will stay the same. But if you are talking about internet drafts or other SDOs documents, that can get you nasty surprises. But yeah, I think it's a good idea to think about wildcarding as a way, as an alternative way to get the important properties of namespacing without having to prepend this COSI dot. But we still have to do something about the rules that are in the transitive closure, like the label rule that I just talked about. So RFC 9052 has a label rule, and we cannot just dump this into another CDDL spec, because they are likely going to have a label as well, and that might be subtly differently defined. So we have to do something here in any case. So that's actually something that I also talked about on, no, it's 3 slides ahead. I get to that.
Just a brief question, do we really have an issue with that label rule? Because that's already in, that should be covered by the undefined list. So we haven't defined a new document has a defined label, so that gets used. And if the inputs are as hygienic as you mentioned, then if it says label in there, it would still refer to the label that is not addressable from the outside of the internal import, right?
Yeah, but the isolation is not that great. So if you actually decide to import a rule, you import the rule. And this means that after import RFC 9052, without an ASCII, you have a label in your rule set.
Even if it's not on the undefined list?
Well, it gets on the undefined list because something in 9052 that you are explicitly importing via your undefined list uses it.
Yeah, but only for the scope.
There are no scopes. I mean, the result is a CDL1 file, and a CDL1 file doesn't have scopes. So any scoping we can do, we have to achieve by using namespacing.
Then, but so if there is a label, if I would write a document that says label is uint, and then okay, that's probably bad because label is actually uint. Label is my funny stuff, and then I import RFC 9052.
Then you're getting a conflict.
Okay.
Because the transitive closure of your undefined references is what gets dumped into your CDL file. So you get another definition for a label with which conflicts with what you have.
Wouldn't the CDDL processor be completely within its right to rename this label to __? I don't have a prefix for this, but
Yeah.
I still keep prefix _ label and then have kind of it still can have scopes. And if the thing it exports to doesn't have scopes, it might need to get creative. But
all I'm saying is that it's probably easier to give the person who's doing the importing here a way to decide what that scope name is, and then you are safe. So the first line, the semicolon hash import line with the as COSI, that makes sure that you won't have that conflict.
yeah, but that also means that if I'm using any document that is not already as set in stone as an RFC, I will have to go for as COSI, because a new document, if a new document revision, even if it's like otherwise completely compatible, could always introduce some name that I also happen to be using. So that would make non-as imports a completely hazardous game.
Yes.
Okay.
But you may not care.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the convention should be to use this as stuff, and there may be reasons why you don't need that. But that's probably because you know exactly what you are importing there. So the coupling gets higher if you remove the as clause. So there is another aspect about this namespacing that uses this dot name character, which we actually put into CDDL to be able to do something like this about 7 years ago. Of course, there are specs out there that have something like coswid dot something. So they already are using such a name character, and that might lead to slightly unwieldy coswid something in the output CDL. So yeah. But I think in the end, since the importer controls the prefix that is being added, the likelihood of collisions here is pretty small, except maybe for innocuous collisions, which come from importing something in a diamond. And that's already handled by the identical redefinition rule, so that doesn't hurt. Yeah, and I think the important property is that you get told about things you are doing that don't work. Okay, racing through this now. The objectives for having an as is to namespace of the internal names, what we just discussed. And the objective of not using an as is to have uncluttered names. And maybe there actually is something in between, which is this weird statement here, which says we import RFC 9052 as COSI, except the name COSI key, that is not namespaced. So that may be a little bit weird, but that would solve the problem that you don't want to get these names cluttered. And of course, we could have some wildcard rule here. That would be a place where I would have less of a problem with wildcards. Okay, I haven't implemented this from thing yet, but it would be pretty easy to do that. Okay, I have two more slides. One is we have to have bike sheds. No protocol is complete without bike sheds, and I think I found the first one. Should there be a space between the semicolon hash and the word import or include? So I'm asking you to take home this style questions and when the opportunity hits, give me an answer. But I'm sure there will be a few other things that I just chose something for which has a much better choice that I'm just not aware. So please do think about that as well. And final slide. Almost all of what I said today works with ABNF. The only thing that really is difficult is that ABNF doesn't allow dot in the name, so we will have to come up with some other convention like 3 dashes or whatever. Yeah, but otherwise we can do all this for ABNF. Obviously, the processor is a completely new implementation because the processor is cognizant about the structure of CDDL. So processor for ABNF will have to do different things for ABNF. But I think the principles actually work, and being able to reference ABNF and possibly have that namespace is really, really useful. So almost all documents that do something with ABNF have some references from 5234, like digit and so on. And we should probably make that easier. But right now, of course, we are not going to try to actually change ABNF, but just to do this for the ABNF support in CDDL. So this would then at some point actually update RFC 9165. And I also have some other ABNF modelizations on a GitHub repo that I think I will be telling people about soon. We have 2 minutes.
Marco, Richard, questions, comments?
Yeah, I had one small thing, and yeah, I need to look into this a bit more to understand it better, to give some more. But one thing I had in mind was these as keyword that could be used for both import and include statements. Is that correct? Or?
Can you say it again? The
as term or keyword, could that be combined with both include and import?
Yes.
Okay.
Originally, I only wanted to provide it for import, but then I found it's easier to implement it for both. So I implemented it for both.
Okay, but then okay, fair enough. Then I get this. So it's usable for both. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Marco?
My comment is it's a lot to digest.
Actually,
Yeah, indeed.
it's incredibly simple. I was really surprised by it's like 80 lines of code or something like that.
That's nice. Yeah.
Oh, for me, I didn't mean for the processor.
I also have a comment on the topic of import as. I would one hope that I have for CDDL2 is that it will help me match an item that has CDDL that I know to follow some CDDL with code that I have. And when items when CDDL gets names get changed through that import, I may want to still have access to that original name because that name might be somewhere in the code because I'm, for example, parsing it into some cozy structure that knows all its items by the original name. I'd assume that if my processor were CDDL2 aware, it wouldn't need to go through the expansion and would thus see the items somehow in their original form. But I'm not sure how that would work. The way I'm thinking is like in I don't know if it works in C, definitely it works in Rust, where you can have a function but also tell it that its name for the purposes of linking is this and that. Roughly that mindset.
Yeah.
I don't.
Part of that is covered by the fact that something like import from will simply generate foo equals cozy.foo rules, because that's much simpler than trying to change the imported module to use the unnamespaced name everywhere. So the information will be in the rules. But yeah, I think it would be nice to be able to recognize automatically added namespace prefixes. So maybe we need a different convention like ... and not just dot.
Dot could still be present, but
It could, but
maybe the
you would
programmatic approach is like already good. If it's somewhere in the metadata, I'm good.
warn people that it's not a great idea, like not a great idea to start variable names with underscore and C.
Yeah, like everyone, he did that.
Yeah, but I mean, everybody who works with C knows that they will get burned. So
Yeah, right. You would hope so.
there may still be a good reason to want to get burned, but yes. Yeah, that's an interesting point I didn't think much about yet. So thank you for that.
I guess we'll come back to that when the topic of back annotating CBOR comes into, or annotating CBOR comes up. Okay. Any more questions on this? Anything for any other business? Here again, there's one very brief. Sorry, Carsten, was that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that my objective here was to get you to actually play with the thing and install CDLC in a recent version and start using it in your project. So I get some more feedback about how well it works and where it actually starts hurting.
Speaking of how well it works, when I don't say tcddl, I get some AST output. Is that stable and or documented and or has a plan forward? Because that looks really nice, and I may want to. I'd much rather pass this than CDDL.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons I wrote the tool, because people want JSON and no, don't want to write parsers. So it's documented. The freezer document actually has a section about that. It's also actually an AST, and I found that I actually want to process rules before actually working on them. So there is a second form that you get with a -r flag for CDLC. And that's actually much more useful, but also it's not documented. So
what's that? What flag?
Sorry?
What's that T flag?
-r, CDLC -r. And then you get another form of JSON that for instance, has parameters of generics resolved. So you no longer get the name of the parameter which you really don't care about because it might be conflicting with some other names, but you get a number that is local to the rule that is using the generic. And these are the little things that are done with the -r. And it's the -r form that I actually know how to do these CDL2 things on, and that is also supported by the CDL writer in the tool.
What language is that? Because it has equals, greater than, and it doesn't look like JSON, but it doesn't look like CBOR diagnostic notation either.
Yeah, I'm outputting this with a Ruby print statement.
Okay.
I probably should convert it into JSON because it's still JSON. Thank you for. Can you say -t neat, NEAT with a -r? Then you should probably see it in JSON.
Oh, yep. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
Okay,
but action point for me, write this up. It's of course not. It's even simpler than the AST stuff, but I have to write it up.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I think that's it for today. See you all in 2 weeks. Well, actually in 1 week because that's CBOR, but yeah. Have a nice evening.
Yeah, same to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Matt.
Bye-bye.
Sure,
Bye.
bye.